Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session, How Did We Get Here? Leadership Past, Present, and Future. We have two presenters today. First is Amanda Biller. Amanda is a career, teamwork, and leadership specialist, special effects technician, successful manager, businesswoman, performer, and accomplished martial artist. She shares the belief that practice is the best preparation and is the best way to permanently change behavior. A graduate psychology from St. Mary's College, Amanda also has the academic knowledge to back up 20 years of professional and business experience. She has leveraged this skill set as a teamwork and leadership developer for 8 years, while still remaining an active leader in business and special events management, so as to keep her own skill set sharp, relevant, and inside reality for clients. Amanda lives in Frederick, Maryland with her husband. Her co-presenter is John Kolm. John is a career specialist in team and leadership development. Born in Australia and having served for 10 years in the Australian and US intelligence communities, he emerged with a firm conviction that practice is the best preparation. He has never once used knowledge gained from PowerPoint presentations or lecture when under stress. In 2004, he wrote a global bestseller on success and leadership at work called Crocodile Charlie and the Holy Grail, published by Penguin in 7 languages and 14 countries. The sequel will be out soon. John's academic background is in math and psychology. He is a graduate of the University of Melbourne and the U.S. National Cryptologic School. He lives in Potomac, Maryland with his wife and son. Ladies and gentlemen, Amanda and John.
Well, hello, everybody. And Cheryl, I just can't thank you enough for that wonderful introduction. You'll be hearing from both Amanda and I today. That at least provides a little bit of variety in the voices, and you'll hear from Amanda a little bit later on. Welcome to How Did We Get Here? Leadership, Past, Present, and Future. This is what we look like. I don't know about you, but I always like to imagine the face when I hear the voice. So these are current pictures of John and Amanda. This is my favorite quote, at least in this area, and you can read it as well as I, although some of you might be watching on a very small screen. So for them, I'll read it out. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. A famous writer in an equally famous book, Alvin Toffler, in his book, Future Shock. It's been a while since Future Shock came out now, but that advice is as relevant as it's ever been, and it couldn't be more relevant to the future of leadership and team development in the workplace. Here's the plan for this session. We're going to kick off with a little thought experiment. I just want to ask you to think about something. This is as close as we can get to a practical demonstration in a pre-recorded session. I hope you'll enjoy thinking about the thought experiment in the back of your mind and maybe revisit it at the end of the presentation as well and see what you think. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here. It has been a fascinating journey, and I would argue, and for the purposes of today, that that journey really began in the closing days after the end of World War II. That journey of teamwork and leadership, training and development methodologies that have brought us to the present day and account for many of the present practices. Where we are now, I'm going to chat a little bit on where we are now, or at least where I see us being now. And I do want to stress that it's really not just my viewpoint. Rather, Amanda and I are trying hard to represent the viewpoints of a great many people that we have the great good fortune to be able to talk to every single day because it's our job. We do team and leadership development for a living. We don't do anything else. So we get to spend our days talking to very senior people, asking questions like, why did you do this? How did you do that? Why did you make that decision? Where do you think the future is going to take us? What are the issues right now? So we want to share some of that with you. And then Amanda is going to chat a little bit about where she thinks we're going next. And I'm going to have a little chat about that as well. And finally, we'll just get back to the original thought experiment and see what you thought. Here's the thought experiment. This shouldn't be too difficult for any of you to imagine. Imagine that you have a work team that always gets things done late. We've probably all known work teams like that. It's a great team, but they just cannot get things done on time, not to save their souls, no matter what. No matter what you say, no matter how you train them or tell them, guys, you're running late, you need to do something, it always ends up the same. They always come screeching in sideways with peeling tires, and they're always a bit late. It's not that they don't understand how bad that is. They know very well how bad that is. They're intelligent people, but it just keeps happening. So here's the thought experiment. Since you're all experienced in the training world, either as buyers and selectors of training or as providers, how would you design a solution for that that's based completely on talk, completely on the classroom, and completely on PowerPoint slides? And remember, the goal is not to get them to understand that it's bad, they know that, to understand that late is bad, they know that, but to actually get things done on time when previously had found it impossible. How would you design a talk-based, classroom-based, PowerPoint-based program that achieves that? And we'll return to that little thought experiment a little later in today's session. In the meantime, let's talk about how we got here. The modern world of team and leadership development really began in 1945. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945, and as that picture shows, it was a time of euphoric celebration. Dancing in the streets, partying, folks hugging total strangers, climbing lampposts, cheering, completely understandable. They're joyful, they're still alive, the war is over, now they think they have a future for themselves. But almost immediately, and coupled with that, is a massive desire to get out. These people don't want to be in the military, they've done their service, but they're actually postmen and dentists and veterinarians and trainers, and they want to get back to their real lives. So they have a massive desire to get out of the military as soon as they can, and it is the biggest demobilization in history. Almost all of the folks who made up these enormous armies, navies, air force, and marine corps that we had in World War II want out. They want to resume their lives and pick up on 5 lost years. This creates tremendous trouble and worry for the people involved in training and development, because all the experience is going out the door and it's not coming back. What are they going to do? There's a new influx of keen people who actually want careers in the military. They need to be trained. How are we going to do that when everybody's leaving? Well, the answer is that they come up with a couple of simple solutions. And this, folks, is the beginning of the team building era. Yes, team building programs are that old, 75 plus years old, because the people that are left in the military decide to do leadership training for young people using what they know, and what they know as military paradigms. So that's where the old team building game of get across a river using 4 steel drums and a dozen wooden planks and a few bits of rope, and we'll shoot holes in one of the drums so it won't float, and you have 15 minutes, go do it. And this is a very effective method that is clonable, repeatable, scalable, and works when you don't have nearly enough instructors and way too many people coming in and the chaos of a massive demobilization. It is a big part of the solution that they choose at this time in the immediate post-war era. People in the civilian world see that, they think it's good, it's cool to be outdoors, the sun's shining, this sounds like fun, and it begins to be picked up and applied in the civilian world, even though the paradigm is actually a very different paradigm. And more about that in a moment. There are a couple of things that make the team building game approach work for the military that need not necessarily apply to the modern world that we live in. The first is, never forget that this is young people learning basics. They really do need to be told that there's no I in team and that together everyone achieves more, because most of the people affected here are officer cadets being trained for leadership. They're typically aged somewhere between 18 and 21, and they don't know the basics. This kind of team building game approach is great for the absolute basics. How appropriate that is for a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 50-year-old experienced leader with 1 or more college degrees is a very arguable thing, though. It's no problem if people get hurt. It's the military. If you can't handle getting hurt, don't join the military. So all of the twisted backs and twisted knees and broken wrists and dislocated shoulders and concussions that you get from these kinds of physical activities are okay if it's the military. Carrying somebody piggyback, trying to feed them through a spider web and trying not to drop them. Trust falls. By the way, the big danger in a trust fall is not the person falling, it's that they land on you and break your nose. That happens quite commonly, and it's a nasty injury. No problem in the military though, because it's the military. Likewise, touch is no problem. Even unwelcome touch, physical touch, as long as it's accidental and not intentional, is understood in the military. You are going to get touched and shoved and handled and pushed around if you join the military, and one day it may save your life. So as you get fed through the spider web on the team building game, if somebody grabs you and they grab a body part that's very confrontational to you, that's okay, as long as it's not done maliciously or mischievously, because it's the military. It's anything but okay almost anywhere else. These games are also, because of the era, 1945 to 59, are conceived in a paradigm of Western male culture. Nothing inherently wrong with Western male culture, but there are many other kinds of cultures in the world and many other kinds of people in the world, and the world looks like many kinds of people, particularly in this country, which is a nation of immigrants, including me. And finally, it doesn't need to be complicated. You're not trying to get people to solve complex problems. That comes later in their career, once they get promoted, certainly major, lieutenant colonel, that kind of level. But right now, not at all. Just real simple stuff like be prepared, work together, think about the team. Basic messages that don't necessarily transfer to experienced leaders and managers in the wider world. But you can still find team building games all over the place, even 75 years later, and they're by no means all bad as long as the context is understood. Now it's 1960 to 1974, and for those of us like me who lived through it, we know that this is the era of personal growth. The civil rights movements begin. The rights of the human being become very important. The rights of the individual. People start to think about the path of the individual through life. My opinion matters in a way that it did not matter in the previous generation when it was all about clubbing together at any cost. My feelings matter as well. I have a right not to be offended, a right not to be excluded, a right not to be treated badly or given less opportunity than somebody else just because of how I look, or my accent, or where I'm from, or because I'm too tall, or for any other reason. Self-actualization now becomes important. Abraham Maslow comes along with these ideas, and his ideas now become popular because they've been published for a while. The right for me to determine the course of my own life, and my expectation that my employer will help me with that, and at least certainly not stand in my way or tell me that it isn't important. And I want training now in this era that reflects that. The training needs to reflect the times. It can't be fish out of water. It needs to accurately reflect and ideally a little bit anticipate the cultural context in which it happens. Otherwise, it will be automatically perceived as irrelevant. And this transforms this tectonic change in society, particularly in the Western nations, transforms the training industry. Suddenly, you see a plethora of offerings that have to do with personal growth. You see a plethora of offerings that have to do with psychological insights. This is when the MBTI, the famous and sometimes controversial MBTI, is born. First published in 1962. That's no accident. Psychological insights are in. People need a belief system to cleave to, and they expect their training to champion some kind of belief system to cleave to as well. Psychology is no longer something that people with beards do to rats. Psychology is now something that is of interest to the common person, to everybody in the workplace. This is new. My career, my rights, and my fate become very important. So leadership training in the corporate world and the government world is now skewed somewhat toward the personal qualities that make people successful, rather than the old follow me chaps model of the previous decade. A deeper understanding of the why becomes important. Now, this business about the why is something that's very trendy and popular right now because there was a TED talk done about it that a lot of people saw, but it actually begins in the civil rights era. Why am I doing this? Why is it important? Why are other people doing that? Why should I care? Why should I be involved? People start demanding reasons and looking for explanations and a deeper understanding. And now we move into 1975, and I wonder if any of you remember these things. If you do, you're giving away your age. Suddenly, this gadget appears in classrooms, corporate and otherwise around the world. What in the world is that thing? The answer, of course, is it's an overhead projector. This is really the first touch of a coming revolution of technology that reaches out and again transforms the team and leadership development industry in a very, very dramatic way. The advent of technology begins with these things. They appear, suddenly they're used. The very presence of the overhead projector changes the way training and development is delivered. Now the trainer is sitting on a chair with their head down, not facing you, but facing the projector and looking at what they're doing. And you're looking not at them, but at the screen. It's important. It's the advent of cool new things. The first training movies come out, and how exciting are those? I was in school, and whenever we knew that there was going to be a training film, a cheer went up because it meant that it was a break from the regular routine of listening to the teacher. Real science, aspirational science, and pseudoscience begin to creep into the world of teamwork and leadership development at this point. More about that later. It's because the pace of innovation is very rapid. Overhead projectors become laser pens, become whiteboards that actually register what you write on the whiteboard, become computers, become laptops, become projectors, become all the things that we know. And these days, of course, we have virtual reality coming in. There's some element of novelty, which is exciting. And suddenly people begin to expect novelty in their teamwork and leadership training. They never did that before. It's the technology that makes people want the new and the exciting and the latest. And the medium becomes intertwined with the message. It raises some questions for the training industry at this time and makes some very big changes. For one thing, training is suddenly scalable. Once you make a how to manage a workforce movie, you can show it to 1 million people. You don't have to deliver it in a classroom 1 million times. So suddenly the finance people become involved in training because now they regard it as a fungible and adjustable cost to do with scalability. So now everyone involved has to deal with financial implications as well. Financial pressures, not just to lower costs, but to actually change the way they train. The downward pressure on costs leads to the conflation of training with entertainment as these new media become widely distributed. And here on the left, you're looking at a famous series of movies. And yes, that is John Cleese. John Cleese owned a company called Video Arts, and he did a lot of corporate training movies to capitalize on the advent of technology era. And that creates an issue for trainers. What are we here to do? Are we supposed to train people? Are we supposed to entertain people? If we're supposed to train people, then doesn't that make us boring? And if we're supposed to train people, then John Cleese is way better at it than we are. So who are we now? Where do we fit in as trainers? And it's a period of people going adrift, a period of people not really sure anymore what their purpose is, and the senior executives who fund them also not sure. And at one extreme end of it, you get Canadian writers like Marshall McLuhan, who says, quote, anyone who tries to make a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either one, unquote. Now, I don't agree with Marshall McLuhan at all, and perhaps some of you don't either, but this is the voice, these are the voices that begin to be heard in this era, the advent of technology. And that brings us to 1990 through 2010, and that is the era of battling gurus and battling methodologies. Carnegie, people like, that's Dale, not Andrew, write How to Win Friends and Influence People. Other famous leaders come along, famous gurus, I should say, names like Drucker, who wrote a great many books on management. Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1 Minute Manager in 1982. J. Edward Deming, who wrote Out of the Crisis in 1982. Tom Peters, In Search of Excellence, again, 1982, it was a good year. And a couple of years before that, one that we all know, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, first published by the man you see on the left, or written by at least, and that, of course, is Dr. Steve Covey, 1989. When there is uncertainty, the history and philosophy of science tells us that we are attracted to gurus with answers. When you see a great following toward this guru who has the answer, and then that guru who has the answer, what you can be sure of is that it's the product of great uncertainty, which in turn is the consequence of where people came from. When there's complexity, the greatest desire human beings have intellectually is the desire for decomplexification. So when these gurus come along and say, I have the one answer, I have the one way, everyone else is wrong, don't listen to them, I have the only answer. That's actually very attractive when there's complexity and uncertainty, and especially when there is no good science, or when there is just imitation science, when the forms of science are being imitated. As Richard Feynman, the physicist, used to say, we gather data for this and we analyze that and we test this and that hypothesis, but really we're just imitating the forms of science. There's no actual science there. Some people, like Covey, are serious people who are properly trained and are making a real effort to add to the community of ideas and are careful about the claims they make. And some others, well, perhaps they're a little bit less careful. Personalities, brands, and marketing, and the ideas that go with it all get conflated. Battles begin between the acolytes, the followers of various different gurus. Each believes themselves to be more right than the others and is heavily invested quite often in that philosophy, and arguments spring out all over the place about methodologies, this method versus that method, Covey's beliefs versus Tom Peters' beliefs, whether Maslow is right or Eysenck is right, and these debates rage across the training industry. And also one size begins to fit all cultures and needs, whether it does or not. So we pick a guru, we implement methodology, we apply it like a cookie cutter across the board, and everybody just has to live with it. Jumping ahead a little bit to 2012, I want to point out that in 2012, Colin Powell, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, former Secretary of State, writes his famous book, It Worked for Me. And if you don't own that book, you should get a copy today. And Powell, who has lived through this era, uses that book as a platform to reject the whole thing as a wrong road. And what he says is, quote, organization doesn't really accomplish anything. Plans don't accomplish anything either. Theories of management don't matter much. Endeavors succeed or fail because of the people involved, unquote. Now, while we're adding books, I will add, just for due disclosure and honesty, that I am also guilty of, as a person who has written a book. It was a serious attempt to add to the thinking, and there's no fold out in the back explaining how you can buy our fabulous services at a discount, anything like that. It was a serious attempt. It was a global bestseller, but my point is it would never have been published had not the era been right, had not the public mood been right for books of that kind. It's a classic syndrome that we see again and again in the evolution of science and human affairs. 150 years ago, medicine was exactly like this. There was no science. It was one person's opinion versus another versus another. They each had followers and acolytes. They all competed for your attention and your belief system. And your best hope, if you were really sick, was to find the most distinguished, most whiskery, most expensive, most popular, most trendy doctor that you could and ask them what they thought the problem was, knowing that they would not agree. The agreement, the convergence only came with the advent of science. And that, I think, is the future of the training industry. In fact, I think it's our only hope. 2011 to 2020, battle of the platforms. Do we have a lecture room, or are you better off in small groups? Should we do this in person or online? Swings and roundabouts, there are pluses and minuses either way. Should we embrace fully immersive virtual reality, or shouldn't we? I can tell you my wife won't be, because every time she tries to, she throws up. It makes some people intensely nauseous. Should we go in a related vein, bleeding edge or not? Do we go leading edge or bleeding edge? Do we try the very latest thing, or do we wait till the technology's matured for a while at the risk of being a little bit behind the curve? The reality here is that nowadays, some people are sick of online. And this is feedback I'm getting increasingly, and Amanda and those who work with us, from the people that we work with and the people that they know. People see the value of online. It has value, but they're sick of it. On the other hand, face-to-face is a lot more trouble. We know that. Online is scalable. And to the finance manager, that means cheap, cheap, cheap. So trainers now have to listen to that voice as well. Face-to-face, on the other hand, works well. And if you want to study the science behind that, I recommend a book by Susan Pinker called The Village Effect, The Village Effect. And that contains a lot of collated scientific research that shows that face-to-face accomplishes things that online cannot. And whether you believe that or not, it's a very good book to read. And we see a great many self-interested parties. The virtual program sellers are telling us how virtual everything is wonderful. And the face-to-face programmers are telling us how virtual doesn't do anything. The reality, as with most advents of new ideas, is somewhere in between. And really, online is not a new idea at all. It's been around for decades, just getting better. Horses for courses seems to be the conclusion of this era, and that brings us to the present era. At this point, I'm hoping that Amanda will come online and tell us what she thinks. And remember that she's talking here from a very solid academic background and 20 years of experience in a wide variety of environments in teamwork and leadership. Amanda, why don't you talk for a bit about where you think we are now?
Absolutely, John. And I just wanted to double check that you can hear me right now.
Loud and clear.
Great. All right. So let's talk about the experiences that we and the people that we've worked with have had. I do team and leadership development for a living, and I've spoken to many senior leaders and their teams. And what we found is that when we're trying to learn a skill set, that a lot of those boxed trainings just don't give us what we want. And so what we had to do is just go down to absolute brass tacks. We had to go down to the bedrock. And the thing about the bedrock is that it's been around for a very long time. In this case, as far back as the Roman military. And what I'm talking about is that the Romans used simulation to train their military. And when I say the word simulation, a lot of people think I'm talking about video games. And I'm here to tell you that the Romans did not use video games to train their military. When I talk about simulation, what I'm actually talking about is the unbolting from the task of the real world consequences. We're going to take those real world consequences and separate them and put them to the side for a moment when we're training this particular task. So first thing you're going to look for when you need to train to learn a skill set is simulation. You're going to look for three things. The second thing you're going to need to learn any skill set, and now I'm talking about whether you're a kid learning to ride a bike, an adult who wants to be a concert pianist, or a team who wants to learn to work together, is you're going to need individually tailored training for this particular skill set and this particular person or people. So those are two things you're going to need. And the third thing you're going to need is practice, practice, practice. So the team or the individual is going to be introduced to the skill set. But if that's where you stop, they're going to have a passing introduction, but they're not going to know that skill set very well. So what you want to know is that they're being introduced to the skill set, and then they're getting a chance to go over and have several iterations of trying the task using those skills. So when you're looking for skill set learning, look for simulation, individually tailored, practice and preparation. And that's it, John. Over to you.
Amanda, thank you very much. And if we only had 5 minutes to speak to you today instead of about 35 plus questions, then that would be the 5 minutes I would choose, what Amanda just said. If you're wondering what that thing down to the left is, this is a photograph we had that we were able to use, and so we used it. This is one of our groups actually, and they're involved in some very intense planning during a team simulation. They're planning something complicated and difficult. This is a work team. Where are we now? Chapter 2. Science, folks, has arrived, and I, for one, am applauding. And by that I mean real science. What you're seeing here, and again, it's Amanda because she volunteered to be an experimental subject. The lady working on her is Tricia Galloway, who's from the Brain Research Institute in the School of Medicine at UCLA. And Tricia, as you can probably gather, is fitting an EEG headset to Amanda's head. There's a lot of this going on right now. We are at a new golden age in the research into how teams and groups learn and how they uptake and use that learning and transform it into behavioral change. Why? Because technologies have made it possible, that's why. EEG has actually been around for decades. You could have an EEG decades ago if your doctor thought there was something wrong with you, but this is a new generation of EEGs. These are light, they're cheap or cheapish, and they enable people to put an EEG not on the head of one person, but on the head of an entire team and study it carefully and see what the brain is doing. We have been very privileged to work on this a little bit with UCLA, the Brain Research Institute, also with the JUMP Medical Simulation Center in Peoria, Illinois, and to a lesser degree with a few other universities. But they're not the only people in this game. It is like the Klondike. You literally can't help but stumble over gold nuggets anywhere you go. Leaders are better informed than they've ever been, and that means they're more skeptical than they've ever been. They don't have to speculate as to how well classroom training or how well team building or how well any of those historical approaches work. They can look it up now and they can find reputable resources, not the advertising pages of the people who do them, but proper studies from places like Harvard. So leaders are more skeptical than ever, less willing to believe that for their dollar, they'll get real behavioral change. Why training dollars seem to be limited. The major cause of that is people who just aren't sure that that's the best place to put their money. It's a challenge we all have. There is wide skepticism of that value today. But that also means that there is great opportunity because, as they say, no supporter like a convert. No enthusiast is as enthusiastic as the person who initially was skeptical and then got their ideas turned around. The greatest strides in psychology of learning and the transformation of learning into behavior are happening right now. And it's just an amazing thing to watch, and it's a privilege to watch. The biggest discovery of all, summarizing a few years of work into one sentence, is neural pathways. What neural pathways mean is simply that there's no software in the brain, and when we learn a new skill, be it riding a bicycle or counseling a difficult staff member, there's actually no difference at all to the brain. The brain has to build new hardware, new neural pathways to do that, and that is the only thing the brain can do, and the only way it works is what all the science is telling us right now. So to learn to ride a bike, we need to try again and again until those pathways get entrenched and perhaps also compete with and eventually overwhelm other pathways that say, oh my gosh, I can't ride a bike. The same goes for counseling staff, leading staff, dealing with difficult situations, getting things done on time, all the skill sets that make up the competencies of the good leader and the good team member. It turns out what the brain research seems to be telling us is that doing it again and again and again and again seems to be the way to get behavioral change. And from what we know today, and it could all change tomorrow, but from what we know today, it seems as though it's the only way. We only learn by rehearsal. Had that statement been made 15 years ago, it would have been controversial, but now the science is beyond dispute. And if anybody wants copies of relevant scientific papers, they have only to ask. Where are we going next? And by the way, Amanda, you're very welcome to rejoin us. We would love to see your happy, smiling face.
I am here, John, but I'm not in charge of which faces you can see.
I understand, but we see you, and we're delighted to see you.
Hello, hello.
I apologize for the graphic on this not being very exciting, but the message of this graphic is you are not alone. We think simulation is a big part of the next step. Is it the only answer? No. The last thing we need is another guru telling you they have the one true way and you should ignore all other ideas. It's simply that simulation is demanding a place at the table, and this is the newest development. It's because it's based on rehearsal and behavioral change, which is what we think the brain does now. And here are 3 examples. Pfizer has abandoned almost all of its classroom training and replaced it with a model called the 70-20-10 model. 70% of their training dollar is now spent on the job. 20% of their training dollar is spent on simulations. That's where our little team comes in. That's what we do for them. And only 10% of their training dollar is spent on the classroom. So those old faculties, the old classrooms are gone. And there's only 10% now for things that absolutely have to be taught in the classroom. Toyota adopted a model of training supervisors and managers through simulation intensively about 20 years ago. They've been doing it ever since. Again, I can speak from firsthand here. We've been very fortunate to have worked with them for that entire time and developed some methodologies with them. It's been a thrilling ride. Certainly, I think I learned far more than I ever taught. But Toyota is just an astonishing culture and an amazing place to work. And they do not lecture people. They do it by simulation every time they can. And finally, the Fed. And to the left, you see a long list of federal agencies, and that's actually a small subset of people who are now relying heavily on simulation. I know there are many others. I apologize for any I've forgotten or omitted, This is just a sample to tell you that you are not alone if you're beginning also to think simulation is a thing to consider. There may, in fact, even be under the GSA contract system a separate NAICS code for simulation for those who know NAICS codes. That hasn't happened yet, but it might happen soon. And if so, it's going to be driven by these people, the National Training and Simulation Association, NTSA, and they're part of ITSEC, which is the biggest simulation-based organization in the world. We're members. We'll be at their conference in November this year, huge conference in Florida. Please come and join us. I'll buy you a beer or an orange juice. There is, though, no magic bullet. And as one of my heroes, physicist Richard Feynman once said, there are no magical people either. Look for your own unique answers. And as Colin Powell would say, don't be buffaloed by experts and by people who tell you they know more than you do. You're the boss, you're in charge, you need to be satisfied. Raise your standards, raise your expectations, demand more, and then expect it. You might be surprised. Maybe the industry will rise to meet your needs at long last. There's a reading list. Obviously, I don't think you're going to, and Amanda doesn't think you're going to read all those books right now, but we will supply you through TOC with a copy of that reading list. It comes from 3 sources. First is the reading list for the NASA Astronaut Training Program, which Team Results had a small amount to do with. Secondly, the reading list for the State Department Foreign Service Institute Orientation Program, which is where new diplomats get trained and then released and sent off to posts around the world, which we had quite a lot to do with. We trained more than 2,000 of those new diplomats, so we got to know them very well. Again, what a privilege. And finally, people like yourself who get in touch and say, hey, you forgot something. And often as not, we have. If you're in that category, let us know and we'll add it. Getting in touch afterwards is our pleasure. We're not consultants, so you don't need to worry that there's any self-promotional agenda here. We would just love you to get in touch with questions, follow-ups, anything else that you would like to know, and it will be Amanda's and my pleasure to follow up with you. If we don't know the answer, we'll find out. Our networks are not bad, and we can always find somebody who can help. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and just go back to my face. Invite you to ask your questions, and thank you very much for paying attention today. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And again, I just can't thank everyone enough for being with us today. Thank you again.